Hi, I'm Josh. Welcome back to my goddamn channel. I just filmed this whole video, 30 minutes. It was there, push stop, it was gone. Let's try this again. It is Nonfiction November. And for the third year in a row, I'm going to be giving you 10 nonfiction book recommendations. This is, I guess, part 3 of my nonfiction recommendation list. So I actually haven't read much this year because I've been at home a lot of the time because I first finished my grad school and then visiting home, and now I'm about to move to fucking Australia. But for this, I was worried I wouldn't have enough books to actually recommend because I had such a bad reading year. But after looking back in the last year, I actually was surprised to find 10 solid books to recommend to you that I absolutely loved to varying degrees, naturally. I had them separated sort of by themes, but not necessarily by favorites. A lot of these were really good. I love them. You should read them. Let's get to it. The first theme is going to be Halloween related or horror related. I have 2 books here that sort of explore the horror genre. Up first is going to be Into Every Generation, A Slayer is Born. How Buffy Staked Our Hearts by Evan Ross Katz. This is a nonfiction recap analysis book of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show. When I read this, I gave it a solid 5 stars. I absolutely adored it. But was it perfect? No. I came into this as a huge Buffy fan, and because of that, I knew it would have had to done a lot not to just blow me away. So even though it wasn't the perfect book, it was still perfect to me. And I'm just saying that because when I say 5 stars, I want you to have some expectations going in. If you're a huge fan of Buffy, I think you're gonna love this. If you're not, I think you'll enjoy it, but I guess it's not perfect. It starts like half the book as a recap of the show, and I've actually listened to several different recap podcasts of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I watch it continually. I'm always rewatching it ongoing throughout the year. That's not an exaggeration, it's the truth. And I think 2 favorite ones that I have of mine are Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Still Dead. This sort of feels like a blend of the two. It's not necessarily funny, but he has his own sort of touch to the story, to the book, and you can sort of feel that. I think one of my biggest flaws with the book was the writing. I didn't necessarily love his commentary every now and then. I would have preferred it sort of less sprinkled in there, which is odd considering how much I actually enjoy it in podcasts. I don't know, it didn't really mesh for me. But as the recap itself, I thought it did a decent job, as someone who's listened to several different recaps. But when it gets to the section of discussing the drama on the show, on the set, with Joss Whedon, which cannot be discussed. If you love this series, you have to address the issues with it. It also addresses other things like how gender and race are explored in Buffy, or how they're not explored. There's a discussion of race, actually, as one entire chapter in this book, and I think there's a really good job of discussing many of the pitfalls with Buffy and the problems it had as a 90s and 2000s show. It also discusses the problems with such a feminist show. I mean, they say that Xander was Joss writing himself onto the show, and I think it's knowing what we know about Joss now, I think it's easy to see how he was Xander. Xander is sexist, he's entitled, he feels this ownership towards women, really always sexualizes them and talks down to them if they don't like him, and it's really problematic. I mean, don't get me wrong, Xander has a lot of redeeming qualities, which are discussed in this book, but also a lot of problems. And that's the kind of discussion that's had in this book. And I really appreciate it for that. It's one that needs to be had if you're going to love this show. And I certainly do. Who would I recommend this book to? I think if you're a fan of Buffy, you'll like this. If you're a huge fan, you'll love this. But if you never watched Buffy, obviously it's not for you. But for me, it's one of my favorites this year so far, I think. Next up is probably my most favorite nonfiction book I've read all year, and that is Nightmare Fuel, The Science of Horror Films by Nina Nesseth. And I got this hopeful, like it was a discussion of horror films. That's how I went into it. I did not realize it was a scientific discussion of horror films. I'm not sure how I would have felt going into it. Like, I am a scientist, I love a good scientific take, but if I had known going in that it was science, a scientific analysis of why we love horror, why it works the way it does, and all the different ways in which horror are implemented, I might have been a little skeptical, because I think horror is one of those things that it's kind of so touchy-feely that I could see someone passing speculation as science. And this book is not that. It seriously discusses the scientific history that's explored in this genre, or with the horror genre at large, and with films, and why they work the way they do, like on a scientific level, through peer review. And I love it for that. This is one of those rare cases where I will say that it might be somewhat esoteric. At the same time, I don't think that's a reason not to watch it, not to read it, rather. I think when it comes to science books, if you're worried about not retaining everything, I think it's important to remember you don't have to. I think she does a really good job of summarizing every point, every chapter. And even if you don't take away every nitty-gritty point, you're still learning a lot, and it's still really engaging, in my opinion. And if you're curious to learn more, you could always explore it more outside of the book, or you could reread it. That's what I love doing with science books. I love re-exploring the science, either through this book, through the same book rather, or through other sources. And that really is the only way to learn something new, is to challenge yourself. So this is a book that discusses the science of horror films, but it also discusses the history of horror and how it's evolved, because I think that's sort of quintessential to understand the societal impact horror has had. Honestly, society feeds into horror and horror feeds into society. She has this really interesting discussion of politics, and how politics is very distinctly reflected in the most popular horror of each decade, and I absolutely adored that. And it's a nice addition, or I guess companion, to the scientific discussion, because the scientific discussion itself is as much a discussion of the different tropes of horror genres as it is of the science of those tropes. Like, for us to understand the science, we have to appreciate, why do we use this? Why do we use gore? Why do we use shock? Why do we use a monster or fear? I'm not remembering them very well, but it really breaks down all the different tropes in horror, all the different things that are commonly used by different artists, or by the different producers or different directors, and why they choose them and why they work the way they do. And I fucking adored it. This book was phenomenal. It gave everything it promised to, and I stand by. I do not think that's an overestimation. I think you go in with certain expectations based off what I've told you, and I think it will meet it. I genuinely do. I mean, I don't say that lightly, because it will probably be my favorite nonfiction book of the year. But for the sake of time, I will leave it at that. We can continue on. Continuing with the scientific discussion, we're going to move on to Galileo's Daughter, a historical memoir of science, faith, and love by David Sobel. This is I want to say the third David Sobel book that I've read. She's a very popular science writer. She often writes books focused on women in history. And while this is talking about Galileo's daughter, it is, I think, a misdirection. Galileo's Daughter is featured in this book, but to call it a biography of her is a huge stretch. The focus is still Galileo. We occasionally see letters between her and Galileo that gives a unique perspective of Galileo and I guess the relationship, but really the book is about exploring Galileo and exploring him on a personal level, and perceiving him through his daughter is interesting, but even then I wouldn't say it was a quintessential aspect of the book. For me, this felt like we were reckoning with Galileo, the things he learned, his relationship with his religion. Because for me, the biggest takeaway from this book, I think, was that Galileo, while he was a scientist who really revolutionized our understanding of the world, of the nature, I think he never truly left his religion. He genuinely believed, or wanted to believe, that his work did not conflict with his religion. And obviously there's some issues here, because we have history and we have the Catholic Church crafting or shaping that history. But I genuinely think that even though he was pressured to denounce his work, he genuinely wanted his work to be compatible with his religion. That was the understanding I got from the way David Sobel sort of crafts this narrative. And for me, it was that personal, I guess, conflict of his that made the book resonate with me on a very personal level, hence reaching favorite status, or at least favorite enough to be on this list. Okay, next up, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, an asteroid extinction and the beginning of our world by Riley Black. This is one that I reviewed not too long ago. I think I read it during the summer. It is a nonfiction book about the impact that killed the dinosaurs. Simple as that. I think it's as much good, not just because of that topic, because everyone loves dinosaurs, and the idea of what killed the dinosaurs is an exciting topic to explore. But beyond that, beyond the gimmick that pulls you in, the writing, the structure of this book is really good. That to me is quintessential. It's so easy to come up with an idea. The execution is what matters. And Riley Black here, she did a really good job of executing it here. She takes this story, basically plops us in to a moment in time just before the impact, the day the dinosaurs died, rather, or the impact that killed them happened. We get to see snapshots of them just existing around the globe at the moments leading up to it, and then it sort of we'll jump forward in time just slightly. We'll get to we'll see the asteroid coming down, and she'll sort of craft a narrative of what it might have been like for certain animals, for certain dinosaurs, and then she'll move forward in time progressively further. She'll go from just before the dinosaurs got impacted to the impact, to seconds after the impact, to minutes, to hours, to days, to years, to decades, centuries, millennia, tens of millions of years. While it is a science book, she's not necessarily presenting science just as this is this is that. Rather, she has taken the science, she's done the work for us, and she's used what we know to create a reasonable narrative for us to sort of watch this all play out. And for me, that's what makes this a phenomenal science book for anyone to read. If you're interested in this topic, I think this is the perfect book to read because it turns it into a story. It turns a nonfiction story into a fictionalized one. And I say fictionalized, but it is firmly rooted in the science. At the end of the book, she actually goes back and she talks about the science, the papers, everything we've learned that influence her decision to craft a narrative in a certain way and to focus on certain animals, because it's not as if she can talk about every single animal that's alive. Rather, she focuses on a specific species and she talks about what's happening to them in that moment. Based on what we know about them, this is likely how things played out for them, or reasonably played out for them. And I think it's just really good. I think that's a great way to approach science writing and communicating science to the audience. I should also say that I myself study impact craters. I am not an archaeologist. Is that right? I'm not someone who studied dinosaurs. Like, I do study impact structures all over the world. I'm an expert in the formation of impact cratering. I'm going to Australia to literally study or to model impact cratering into rock on Mars. So this is quite literally my cup of tea. And for me, on a very personal level, seeing this narrative on a sort of related to the life of the dinosaurs played out, to see the impact physically described and sort of integrated into the life of the dinosaurs and the inevitable extinction of them was fascinating. That, on a very personal level, is why this book resonated so strongly with me. Okay, we're almost halfway there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 5, our last science book, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End by Atul Gawande. This is part philosophical discussion, part memoir of Atul Gawande's life up until the moment his dad died. And while this is about him reckoning with the death of his father, I think it is much more about analyzing the way in which people at large, and from his experience as a surgeon, deal with death when faced with it. While this book does explore a lot of ideas, for me, the idea that I think I took away that has stuck with me so strongly since this book is the idea that when people are close to death, whether they're young, suffering a terminal illness, or they're old, nearing just the natural stage of life and death, the thing that matters most to them almost always is going to be said to be the relationships they have with the people close to them, their friends, their family. It's those memories they make that they want at the end. Those are the things that matter the most. As I've lived in Canada for 6 years now, I'm moving now to Australia, across the world for my family. It's a constant thing in my mind where I think about the nature of my life. How long has it been since I've seen my family? How do I integrate them, keep them as a core part of my life, so that I don't look back down the road and think to myself, why don't I have more of those moments to reflect on, to share, to cherish? If we're being honest, I really should talk to someone. We're not here to talk about my mental health, but for me, I'm constantly trying to keep that perspective of the big picture and what matters in life, and making sure that I don't lose track of that when it comes to the direction I'm going and the way I decide what deserves my time, my energy. And I think this book, it stuck with me so strongly because it sort of reinforces that desire I have to see my family. And if anything, it's emboldened it, it's made it stronger, it's made that need for that so much greater. The last thing I'll also say about this is that he also has a deep discussion of what it means to live and die. Like, you have a right to decide whether or not it's worth to extend your life if extending it means living in pain and suffering. And that is a key thing that he talks about, in addition to what matters in the end. I really hope the wind is not too bad with this new mic. I don't know, forgive me. It is a brisk day here in November in Georgia. Really, it's perfect for nonfiction November. Okay, next up, let's switch over to politics. We are just fresh away from the midterm. I'm filming this the Thursday after the elections. And while things or some semblance of a victory at this point, there's still a lot of things we have to worry about. Kill Switch, The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy by Adam Gentleson is a book about the filibuster. And it is essentially a history of the filibuster, why it was formed, how the Senate was formed, to be honest, and how the Senate has evolved, and at what point it started being presented wanted to be the way it is today. And honestly, it's rooted back to Jim Crow. Obviously, the filibuster is older than Jim Crow, but it started being used and worked to become, or be used as, in the way that it is, to stop the progress of civil rights legislation. It's very much rooted in that history. If you go back to the origin of the Senate and the Founding Fathers, the majority rule is still fundamental. The point of the filibuster was to provide the minority party with a voice. It was never intended to give them the control over everything. In the end of the day, the majority is what matters. The majority gets to decide the legislation that is passed. But it's been warped into this idea that the minority party deserves to have fundamental control over whether something gets passed. And that just wasn't the intention of the Senate to begin with. And the fact that people try to present it that way is just evidence either of the misunderstanding people have about history or the misinformation campaigns that are passed to try and perpetuate these systems. It is not a good system. It's rooted in racism and oppression, and it needs to be removed. Damn it. I did a vlog with this. I haven't posted it yet. I'm hoping to get it up for the end of Nonfiction November because it's all about American history, American politics. I'm not going to get too deep into it here, though I want to. This book, I really liked it. It was a very convincing book. I did go in with the idea that filibuster was problematic to begin with. But more than that, as with these previous books, it was well written. I think, like I said, it's not just about the idea, it's about the execution. This one's really well executed. Next up, we're going to continue on in politics, but this time switching over to sort of more personal perspectives, looking at the matriarch, Barbara Bush, and the making of an American dynasty. People probably see this recommendation and think to themselves, why on earth would I give two shits about Barbara Bush? And I understand, like, I would not have picked up this book if it wasn't for the author. The author is a journalist who I follow and am a big fan of, and so I decided to give her work a try for the sake of that. And I really am glad I did, because the point of this book was specifically to address this assumption we have about Barbara Bush as being a insignificant figure in history, when really she was not. She was the mother of one president, the mother of potentially another president that almost came to be, and the wife of another president. And she was a significant political figure during the rise and initial presidency of Trump. Like, she had her own words to say about it. She was a very direct person. She was not afraid to speak her mind. And so she did not play a negligible role in history. And for that reason, I think this book is worth giving a shot. But what I think really works well in it is not just necessarily to understand the role she played throughout her life in American democracy and American history, but also on a personal level. Barbara Bush was very flawed. She had very sexist, patriarchal ideas rooting back to her childhood. This book really dissects that. I wouldn't say it makes you empathize with her, because I definitely don't empathize with her in a lot of ways. But what it does is it helps you understand her. It helps you appreciate how someone goes from what she was to what she became. And it's a really good look at her life for that reason. And I think it's worth reflecting on her, considering the role she played in history and how often she is overlooked. It's also just, again, a well-written book. Susan Page is a great journalist and a great writer. I recommend it for that reason. I want to say again, I recognize that this book probably doesn't seem that appealing on the surface, but I think it's something that's worth giving a second glance. Continuing to look at biographies, we now have another favorite biographer that I love reading, Jill Watts's Hattie McDaniel, Black Ambition, White Hollywood. And this is one that I actually did a live discussion with Brelit from the Locked Petition on my channel last year. I highly recommend checking that video out. Honestly, it was probably one of my favorite discussions I've ever done on YouTube. And that's partly because of this book was just really good. This book, it's about Hattie McDaniel. She was an actress who lived during the Jim Crow times, and she's known for getting very large roles, but also stereotypical roles for black women, older black women, in film. Like, she played the nanny on Gone with the Wind. I think she won an Emmy for that, if that was that correct. I'm not entirely sure if that was the one she won or if she came close. She's also someone, though, who entered the arts with certain goals. When she started doing entertainment, she would be acting in plays like that. She crafted these narratives. They were very targeted critiques of society, its treatment of women and race. But as she got notoriety, she started to get a platform. But that platform came with certain conditions to where she could only have that platform if she started to fit herself to the mold of what the racist infrastructure of Hollywood wanted her to be. And as such, she started to get critiques from people in her time, from the civil rights community, and how she wasn't doing more to fight for her community. What's more, they also critiqued her for even going so far as to reinforce existing stereotypes and oppressive structures. In a lot of ways, this is a damning look at her life, but in other ways, it's an empathizing one. Like, it's impossible to read this, I think, and not sympathize with her, because she's in an impossible situation. She is given this responsibility to somehow change the world on her own, and for me, that was one of the most powerful parts of the book, was to ask this question: why should one person be held responsible for undoing an entire history, an entire nation's history of oppression? What's more, it's worth seeing that you can see she definitely tries. She did her best to fight against it, but at some point she starts to make sacrifices to get further. At what point is it too much? And it definitely isn't my place to say that, but it's a critique that she often got. It reminds me a lot of the books like, say, The Deep by River Solomon, where this talks about generational trauma and the responsibility of one person to hold that trauma and be the one responsible for it. This is a little bit different because it's more about change than necessarily holding the trauma, but it's a similar situation where you have one black woman being forced upon her the responsibility to somehow revolutionize the world. And I think it has analogies to today. I mean, just look at people like Vice President Kamala Harris, who was critiqued for her role as Attorney General in California and how she was not perceived as doing enough. And I think a similar conversation could quite validly be made about her role there and the limits of her power and how much she did versus how much she could have done or should have done. And for me, it's just a really fascinating conversation overall, and it takes a look at a very interesting woman and poised in a position that is just so difficult to manage, that allows us to dissect it. Her life intersects with so many different types of history. That's a really fascinating point of view to analyze those, is what I'm trying to say. Continuing on with the role of women and race, let's now talk about Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis. So this is a book that I struggled reading throughout the year because it wasn't on audio, and I'm someone who's a primarily audio reader, and it's been a very difficult year for me for a number of reasons that I think I've touched on a bit, just to sit down and read and focus. Especially hard when it comes to having to read a book physically, especially a book as deep in content as this one. This is a book that explores exactly what the title implies: the role of women in class and race throughout history. It starts as a reflection of the founding of America and the way in which black women are perceived and the way in which class intersects with that. And it continues that conversation all the way up to the 1980s when this book was originally written. It is a dense book, but a very fascinating and interesting one. It's one of those classic books that literally everyone needs to read, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm not going to get too deep in the content here because there's so much to dissect that really you just need to read the book. It's also not really my conversation to have, so I really highly recommend you give this book a try. I think a book that complements this book really well is going to be Killing the Black Body: Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty by Dorothy Roberts. Dorothy Roberts is a professor, and I believe a scientist, perhaps a social scientist, exploring the role of race in society. In this case, she's dissecting the way in which race and reproduction has impacted liberty, specifically for the black community, for black women and other people with reproductive systems in the black community. In the same way that Women, Race, and Class is talking about this throughout history, this is too. But I think this is able to first extend further because I believe it was written in the 2010s. But it also, I think, does a deeper dive at specific laws and the way they were implemented and the way they inevitably impact the black community more significantly than the white community. It's an example of how we have now, with the overturning of Dobbs, a severe lack of access to necessary reproductive liberties and rights. In principle, like everyone has that problem, but in truth, because of the existing class structures, almost always going to be that white women can more easily access abortions from other locations, going to other states, than the black community can. And that's fundamentally what this book is trying to look at. And again, I'm not going to try and dissect every aspect of this book because it's just too much to talk about. It is a book that I think everyone should read. It was very well written, very compelling, and it's a fantastic next step after Women, Race, and Class. It's almost as if Women, Race, and Class is a 101 class and this is the 202, something like that. I highly recommend both these books, perhaps more than any other book in this list. you really should give these a shot, especially considering the overturning of Roe in the recent months. Honestly, that was why I ended up picking up this book specifically, was because I felt it was a necessary conversation that needed to be discussed or needed to be looked at more deeply. In my personal life, and inevitably on this channel, whenever I get the vlog up for that book and the rest of my American history and politics vlog that I will eventually get to you. Thank you so much for watching this. I really hope this video has stuck through. I filmed this once. I thought it was really good. I was really excited to be getting a video out to y'all, then it stopped and it wasn't there. Well, hopefully this one is. I have enjoyed talking about these to you, even though I'm losing my voice at this point. It's been a solid hour of recording. Let me know if you'll give any of these books a try, or if you have read them before. And again, they're all really good for the various reasons that I've said. I really hope you consider giving them a shot. But as always, have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you all next time on Josh's Bookish Voyage.